Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So good to have all of you joining us today as we talk about bias in AI and ML. Artificial intelligence and machine learning is such an integral part of our lives. It happened somewhat gradually for a while, and then it's picked up speed recently. And we just thought that it would be a great thing to spend some time talking about it because it is so important. And with me, we have Jack Scott, who has a great background in all things cyber and is joining us today as we talk about AI and ML. Welcome, Jax. How are you?
Oh, Dr. Murdoch, I'm excited to be here and I'm excited about talking about this topic.
Excellent. Very, very good. So as we go through the material, we're going to spend some time talking about some of the different aspects related to AI and ML. But of course, the underlying theme here is bias. And that is such an important topic. So we're going to dig deep into that. But before we do, let's start with some definitions, just to make sure we level set when it comes to that and understand what we mean when we talk about some of these different types of bias. So help us out with that.
Absolutely. So we're going to be covering some of the biases that you may see in AI and machine learning, but this is not an exhaustive list that we have here. One of the biases that you might see is called inherent bias, and this is really reflected when there's already a pre-existing bias or prejudice embedded into the AI system. An example of this could be like a hiring algorithm, for example. Basically, the hiring algorithm is using historical data to pull from, and therefore not tapping into maybe that underserved population. Another bias that we might see is systemic bias, and that is basically that occurs when there's an actual bias that is present within the AI algorithm model that is underrepresenting, again, that underrepresented population. And an example of this could be like the AI being designed to recommend loan approvals. And there might be a systematic denial of loans from a certain neighborhood, for example, that you might see.
Mhm.
Another one that we've seen is the feedback loop bias. And this is where the situation is where the bias AI basically results are used as a basis for future decisions. And that loop will then retrain the data to create more and a larger bias. And you might see that in predictive policing, for example. So you might dispatch police officers to a certain area that supposedly has a higher crime rate because they're repetitively being dispatched to that area. There, in essence, is individuals being that are being arrested, but it doesn't mean that there's a higher crime rate. It's just that they're being perpetuatedly dispatched to that area. Another one is confirmation bias, and it is kind of what it is. It confirms a bias. So it occurs when developers consciously or unconsciously create a bias within the model itself. And then lastly is an anchoring bias. And this happens when the initial information that is going into the model is disproportionate and it influences maybe a future decision, and it serves as an anchor to all of the other decisions within that model.
Okay, so this is very helpful because when we think about bias, sometimes we think there's monolithic, right? There's only one type, and that is definitely not the case. Now, there are a couple of other ways we can also dissect this concept of bias, and we have statistical, we have human, and we have systemic. So can we break it down using those three and help us understand what those mean?
Yeah, so I love this image that we have here of the iceberg, and it kind of breaks down the statistical bias, the human bias, and the systematic bias that you might see. So when we're talking about statistical bias, for example, this is a type of bias that arises from the data processing and the validation methods. It's really critical for us to be able to ensure that the way that the data is being collected and processed and used for training the machine learning doesn't introduce or skew the results that we get. So that's when you're thinking of statistical and computational. Underneath it, you have processing validation. This is a bias that can occur during the data being cleaned or when you're putting filters in place, for example. The next one is the use and the interpretation of it. So that's how the data is being used or being interpreted. And then lastly is that selection and the sampling of the data. So this occurs when the data is not well represented of like the overall population. And then we've got just normal human biases. We are normal. AI machines are being created by humans. So with that, you have different biases such as individual and groups. And that just means that a bias enters because of like myself, an individual, or maybe a group that has certain values and certain perceived notions. And then lastly is the systemic bias that we'll see. And you'll see this often. This is deeply embedded in social constructs or institutions. And this can be perpetuated by historical biases, for example.
Yes, so we have a number of different ways that this can happen, and I like the fact that you highlighted this because in some cases we think that this is it's an isolated technology or tool separate from humans, and it reflects us. In a way, it's a mirror. Right, so we have that challenge where, and I remember one of the instances where they say, "Okay, draw me an image of a CEO," and it turned out to be a white male, and part of it is because that is what most people will kind of default to. But there are a lot of women who are also CEOs, right?
Right.
So there's again, be very mindful of that, and there are so many other underlying elements in terms of what is the preponderance of the content on the internet. That when the AI algorithm is going through, scrubbing, picking up all of that, is going to basically say, oh, well, there's a lot of this, that must be it. When
Correct.
that
Right.
may not be what we want to see going forward. It may be a reflection of the past, but we're trying to build a better future. So we need to be very mindful about how those biases are there and how we're trying to, let's call it, cure it. So that's a very important thing. Now, let's take a little bit of a departure because we want to also make sure everyone understands that by participating in today's webinar, they can also be eligible for 1 CPE credit. And one of the needs or requirements for it is that you answer 3 polling questions, which will be happening intermittently throughout this program. That being the case, we have the first question coming up. So let's display that question and please respond. It'll help you become eligible for CPE credit and also gives an opportunity to hear from you so we also get your reaction to some of the content we're talking about. So the first question is, has your organization established a risk management and or governance framework? We're going to let that question stay up for a few seconds, and then we're going to take a look at what the responses are. Also important to note that you also have the opportunity to also submit questions that can then be addressed during our Q&A section towards the end. So please, as you think of questions you would like our guests to answer, please share it with us and we'll take a look at it when we get to that point in the program. Thank you very much.
I'm excited to see the answers that are going to come in for this.
Yes.
So that AI and risk management and the governance framework is still fairly new, and organizations just trying to figure out where they want to take their just overall IA presence in their overall organizations. Many organizations, have you seen, have just kind of blocked AI, but now they're realizing it's inevitable. It's seeping in. So what do? How do they establish a governance program and a risk management program?
Interestingly enough, I like you mentioned that because one of the things that I recall happening early on with the internet and social media in particular is how some organizations will look at things like Facebook and they will say, oh, that's just for people to use on their social space or their personal space, though we don't need it in the organizations. They used to block Facebook. And then eventually it was viewed as something that you can use to put your best foot forward, help the world really get a better appreciation for your organization. And that was opened up. So I guess we're seeing some of that also reflected in how AI is being treated as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's take a look at their responses to the question. So thank you very much for your participation and for providing your responses. So the question was, has your organization established a risk management and or governance framework? So 59% of you said yes, both. I think that's a great statistic.
That is outstanding.
That is outstanding.
Yes.
Indeed, it is indeed. About 6% of you said only risk and only governance. And then we have 16% said none of the above. So there's some room for improvement there, right? For those of you who don't have it yet, know that as far as today's program is concerned, that 59% already have it. So it is happening, and that's something that you can take a look at. Now, the last response option here is I don't know. And the way I like to think of it is, since perhaps the majority of the people who are joining us today are auditors, reviewers, inspectors, regulators, and so on, maybe you need to go and find out.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. Ask the questions.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Go and ask the questions and see where your organization stands as relates to that. So very good. Thank you very much for your cooperation, participation, for sharing your thoughts with us. So let's continue talking about this dynamic around governance and risk management, because sometimes you may feel that there's so much that we need to learn and know, are there any tools? Is there anything out there that we can use to get
Mhm.
started? And the quick answer is yes.
Mhm.
Now, please elaborate on yes.
Absolutely. There is. And one of my favorite institutions is spearheading the way in a lot of change for AI. And we're seeing it. It's NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology. And they have actually helped create a framework to help you understand not only understand bias, but understand how it contributes to harm. So here what you have is this NIST framework that AI auditors or anybody can utilize to be able to systematically evaluate where biases may occur within an AI life cycle. So being able to show you kind of how this is broken down, the first one we have here is this systematic biases. And then you have the data sets on the left-hand side, who is counted and who is not counted, for example. And here we've got issues with latent variables for this one. Next would be your processes and your human factor. So we're talking about automation of inequalities and keeping in mind, this is their framework, but you can customize this to fit your needs. And then the last thing is TEVV. And what that is test, evaluation, validation, and verification. So this is where, for this example here, reinforcement of inequalities. So groups and impacts more with a higher use of AI. So understanding where is it impacting them, and then being able to make those adjustments based on what you're finding here. The next one that we have is touching on the statistical and computational biases. So it goes into those data sets of the sampling. We talked about this in the last slide, like the sampling, the selection biases that could take place. And then the process and human factor portion. Right there are some different types of tools and metrics that you can utilize to be able to understand what is important within this. And then lastly, the TEVs here is the lack of adequate cross-validation, maybe it's survivorship bias and difficulty with fairness. And then the last one is that human piece, that human bias piece. And that first one, we've got that observational bias, availability bias. And then when we go into what is important here, it's groupthink leads to narrow choices. And then finally, that TEVV is confirmation bias, automation bias. So a great tool, NIST SP 1270. I would encourage you to check it out. This is just a small portion of it, but it starts to help you kind of understand how bias is contributing to harm and how we can start looking at it differently within our organizations.
This is very helpful, and we know that NIST has a whole library of
Mhm.
resources available to us. They're all free, so we encourage you to take a look and see how we can leverage some of that content. Now, when it comes to biases, we've been talking about the different types that exist, and just now in terms of the resources. But another thing is in terms of how it affects us. So, what does it look like in terms of what are the harms? Can you elaborate on that a little bit for us?
Yeah, so what we're seeing with biases is I mean, if you're applying for a mortgage or a home loan, or you're trying to get into a university and you're denied access to even care, healthcare, that could not only impact your life, but today, but it could impact your life tomorrow. So these biases could have real altering effect for individuals within their life.
Yeah, so it can affect your life, really, like you
Hmm.
said, in terms of housing, in terms of loans, in terms of employment, various ways that it can do that. And it's not just short term. In some cases, it can be very long lasting. So we need to be very mindful about that ripple effect.
Yes,
Yeah.
ripple effect. Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's consider this long-term impact of an AI. So we've got a ripple effect. So you throw a rock in and then it ripples out. So with AI, let's say you're denied a loan, for an example, or you are unfairly like denied a job opportunity for you. Well, now you're set back years. Your family isn't able to get a mortgage. You're not able to get that loan that you wanted for your business. You're not able to be able to get into the college that you want, or any college at all, because maybe that AI categorized you as a lower income. And what we're seeing is there are AI systems that are having desperate impact, for example, and that are classifying women to have lower credit scores or lower income, and therefore we don't receive a certain amount in a loan, or we don't receive a loan at all, which could have grave impacts on just your overall day-to-day life. And again, it's that ripple effect of long-term impacts that these could have. And another aspect of those like ripple effect is recognizing that these are trainable systems. So when you have a bias within a system and it's not addressed right away, it could ripple and impact even larger. That's why continuous monitoring is so critical when you're utilizing these systems.
Exactly, exactly. And the recognition of those impacts is really a motivating factor. So when we think in terms of what can we do about it then, let's talk about how we can go about auditing against this bias that we identified.
Yeah, so most audits that you're going to see within this environment, and we're going to be talking about what a black box is in the next slide, can take place and will typically take place in a black box environment. And it's really understanding when you're doing an audit how these systems are operating, the purpose of these systems, being able to look at the transparency. Some things that you consider when you're doing a bias audit is maybe looking at a model, a AI model card. So being able to look at what is the purpose of this? What is the possible use case? Is it being utilized outside of that use case? What are the possible biases or fairness or unfairness that it could generate with its output, for example? Another aspect to consider when you're looking at conducting a bias on these is you're not going to be able to conduct a bias on an entire system. It's too laborious for that. You're going to typically be looking at a small section of these AI algorithms. So making sure that when you're looking at them, that you're taking that into consideration as you're conducting these audits.
So when we're thinking about auditing, sometimes we think in terms of what's happening within the organization, and that makes perfect sense, right? You're talking to your developers, you're going to take a look and see what they built and how they did it, so and how it was fed the data and how it was trained. But sometimes we're talking about third parties as well. So we need to be very mindful about that and how we have learned over the last few decades, really, because of Sarbanes-Oxley, that third parties play a very important role and the vendor relationships that you have. Can you elaborate a little bit in terms of that? And in my mind, I'm thinking the right to audit, make sure your service level agreement, make sure you have a relationship with these parties so that you have access and are able to then ask the pertinent questions. Well, what are your thoughts about that?
Supply chain risk management, just as a whole, is growing. CSRM, it's a huge space, and the reason why, I mean, SolarWinds was a great example of how vulnerable we are when we're working with a third party. So AI is the same way, and in the aspect that there's different types of testing environments that you're going to see. You're going to see the black box where you have your input and then you have your output, but everything that's happening in the center, all of those neural networks, all of those layers, you don't know what's actually happening. Typically, you don't see many white boxes. And to your point, the reason for that is you're working with various different vendors. There's not really, I don't really know any organizations that don't have like third-party vendors that they're working with or they're outsourcing anything. So you're going to naturally possibly have a gray box environment where maybe you have transparency for your systems, but your vendor doesn't want to provide transparency because of intellectual property. And those API keys that are feeding into that algorithm are then hence opaque in a manner. So you've got a gray box environment. Regardless, it's still going to be challenging to be able to audit, assess, and conduct assurance validations on these systems.
Right, exactly. So very important that we encourage ourselves within the organization and everyone that we interact with to have documentation and that we have access to those people who have an intimate knowledge of the tool and how it is developed and managed. So with that said, let's take a look at our audience perspective on another question. So let's bring up the second question and what we'd like to hear from you about: has your organization considered auditing the use of AI? We spoke a bit about that just now. So has your organization considered auditing the use of AI? And we would very much like to hear from you. What are your thoughts on this regard?
Yeah, this is such a new area still, and it's emerging, as you know, as an auditor. I mean, there's not a lot of certifications that are out there yet and frameworks. So I'm really curious how many of their organizations have considered auditing the use of their AI. It's going to be very interesting.
Yes. Great. Okay, so while we wait for those responses to come through, another reminder is that if you have any questions that you would like answered towards the end of the program when we get to our Q&A, please share them with us, and we'll be glad to entertain those when we get to that point. So we're waiting a few seconds as the numbers are tallied up. We are going to then take a look at what your experience has been with this and what kind of conversations you're having, because this is something that really needs to be considered and when we're talking about our audit plan. very important that we give it some serious thought, because this is a very important dynamic playing out. So as far as responses go, so here is what we are seeing in terms of, has your organization considered auditing the use of AI? So 9% of you said yes this year. So that's a little bit of a low number, but that's, again, it is what it is, and we'll take it forward from there. Yes, but no time frame has been set yet. That's 34%. So again, it is being considered, and it is on the plan, if you will, on the drawing board. But we don't have a time yet, and that's okay. All right. Now we have 37%, about a third, a little bit more than a third, saying no, it has not been officially evaluated for inclusion yet, and then 20% saying I don't know. So once again, my thought is, if you don't know, let's take a look into that. And in general, again, the key thing is to think about it. It may or may not be a very big component of your organization's dynamic, objectives, and risks. So you may not make it to your audit plan. We have to understand that not having it there doesn't mean that things are not good. It just means that we want to make sure, and we encourage everyone who's joining us today to think about it and make sure he gives it proper attention, right? And that's what it's all about. Yep. Okay, so let's talk in terms of the biases. We've been talking about it, and we defined it, and we spoke about the potential harms. But what are some of the key specifics about it that we need to be on the lookout for? And if we wanted to really look more closely, what are we looking for? What are the dynamics associated with those that are going to be key for this?
Yeah, so it's good to note that machine learning, just the models inadvertently can create biases within their data sets, and it's how they're trained. But you could have the best engineer that created the best model, and inadvertently creates bias within it. So taking that into note, also knowing that there's different types of biases that you might see, and they may impact different variables. And we're only providing you a couple of variables here. One is a protected class variable, which is related to your age, your gender, your race. And the other one is a variable that is a proxy variable. And there's other names for this. You may have heard it referenced in other ways, but proxy variables is its zip code, its names, its facial images. And then it's good to note that there's that systemic and then also statistical uncertainty. And that's where systemic biases are really, they need to be identified, and they can be mitigated because they are made within the system. But statistical biases are kind of a natural part of the model prediction, and they can only really be managed through proper validation techniques or auditing, as we've been talking about.
Okay, so there's quite a bit going on there, and I think it's very helpful if beyond the concepts and the general discussion that we've been having, that we also hone in on some specific use cases. So how about we take a look at it from the perspective of human resources and some of the things happening within that broader space, and then explain how this is manifesting itself. So what's happening in those cases?
Yeah, I think one of the best use cases that we had that was recent was when Amazon came out with an AI tool. It was an Amazon recruiting tool. You all may have seen it out there, an article around this, but the tool was meant to review resumes and recommend top talent. However, what had happened is they had pulled data from the last 10-year period, not recognizing that at that time, it was primarily male-dominated individuals within the industry. So the outcome was actually realizing that the inherent bias was that, and it was a historical bias in a way, that it was pulling this data from 10 years ago, was primarily male, which then in essence, myself and women, we were not actually being pulled into the data set. So when they recognized that the algorithm was favoring resumes from the male population, they discontinued it, refined it. I actually don't know if the AI algorithm is being used now, but I know that it was discontinued to try to figure out how that bias was happening. And a way of mitigating a bias like that is to expand that data set and to bring in more data to help mitigate that bias.
And it's good to have a specific case that we can look at, because in some cases what's happening is this is moving along so fast, and many organizations are using it, and in some cases we don't even know that they are using it. So it's very helpful to see that organizations are doing certain things, and unfortunately there can be some problematic dynamics playing out as a result of it. We have in terms of HR processing, so tell us more about that.
Yeah, where this is, I think, really prevalent right now. I know that I've been seeing it in my own cybersecurity and tech communities as the fact of you're submitting a resume and it's immediately getting booted back. I mean, you'll submit a resume, you have all the experience, and the next thing you know, within 3 hours, you're getting told that you were a fit for this position that's typically AI related. So what we're seeing is inadvertently a favor in certain demographics. We're also seeing that some AI algorithms may be favoring individuals that come from prestigious universities, which is obviously not fair to those that can't afford to go to those prestigious universities. We're also noticing like unfair in like languages and how it's communicating with individuals in this space. So it's that interaction is actually creating biases for those candidates who are trying to get those positions. So this is a big concern. We aren't diving into a law and regulations during this live, but I will tell you that the New York Law 144 is actually one of the first laws that has been enacted to tackle these types of HR biases.
So beyond HR, we have other use cases, and one of those that can be, in some cases, very problematic, and some of our viewers may have experienced or heard about it, has to do with how we're handling criminals, right?
Hmm.
We're talking individuals who are going through the prison system, and some tools that have emerged that supposedly will help judges and others in law enforcement in terms of determining who are higher risk individuals, who are eligible for
Hmm.
parole or not, and so on. So what's happening there? What have we learned from those cases?
Yeah, there was an article that came out, and it was an assessment done on an AI tool called Compass, which is the Correction Offender Management Profiling for Alternative Sanctions. So COMPAS. And the idea of this algorithm was to be able to bring in an individual that had committed a crime, have them go through a select number of questions, and then based on their arrest history and essentially their color, they were able to identify if they were going to reoffend. However, what they identified in this study is that the algorithm was actually classifying white criminals on a lower level and black criminals on a higher level, which what was happening is that most of the white criminals were reoffending, even though they were categorized as low. And what's so unnerving about this is that judges are still using this and have been using this for quite a long time. So they're putting individuals away and behind bars because they see them as a reoffender just because the AI algorithm is seeing you as a darker skinned individual. So this was one of the first use cases that had actually come out around AI algorithm bias at that time.
Very important to pay attention to these dynamics and the lessons that we can extract from it, right? And there's so many other things. This specific one was in terms of offenders, but we have image recognition. And in some cases, what you do is a lot of profiling that can also take place. So in terms of voice assistance, right, we have a lot happening there with a lot of these tools, and not just in the workplace, but in some cases at home as well. So what are some of the dynamics playing out as relates to voice assistance?
Yeah, so we've seen like Alexa and Google Chat and all these different types of smart devices in our homes. And this one article came out on a use case, UNESCO, and that report was around a voice recognition and how they were still having gender divides with using female voices in a way. So they were starting to recognize that voice assistants were still bringing that gender bias as far as women doing these roles. So what we're starting to see, and I've actually even seen it in ChatGPT, you have a voice option now, and it actually provides you three different options. And I think one of them is a female voice, and there's actually two that is a male voice to try to prevent that perpetuated idea that females are your assistants in a manner.
Okay. And we have gender roles, right, which is kind of what you're
Mm-hmm.
highlighting. And in some
Yep.
cases, what happens is perpetuates certain perspectives associated with
Mm-hmm.
those and what people think and do. And also the tone is not just that it's a female voice or a male voice, but in some cases, the tone that is projected can
Mm-hmm.
also be problematic in terms of what it sounds too
Yep.
submissive and so on.
Yep.
So we want to make sure that it's also fair. Now, a lot of things are in the political space.
Mm-hmm.
We're also seeing, and whether we're approaching an election or not, and it's not just because of the United States. I mean, we're talking about global use of some of these platforms. So, what are some of the dynamics we're seeing in the political space related to these biases and how they can influence how the elections turn out?
Yeah, so we're all familiar with ChatGPT, right? So what happened? I love this research to determine if ChatGPT was manifesting political biases. A group of researchers actually administered 5 political orientated tests. And it was done January of 2023. And a political orientated test, just to oversimplify this for you, is a quiz or a list of questionnaires designed to identify political beliefs and values of a person answering that test. So what they did is they took the series of the questions and they actually injected them into ChatGPT to be able to see what the response would be. And so, what they were able to identify, this may be shocking to you, but in 14 out of the 15 political orientated questions, ChatGPT responses were classified as left leaning by the test. And then what they also found is that the remaining tests diagnosed ChatGPT answers as politically moderate. So, this again is repeating administration of just the biases and to be cognizant of the systems that you're using, that now we know ChatGPT could be leaning further to the right based on the answers that it provides you.
So definitely something to be very much mindful about. And of course, if one side of the political spectrum and versus the other one may object to it, right? So
Hmm.
we have to be very mindful about how that's happening as well. So the implications seem to be quite broad in many respects at the individual level, at the organization level, at the national level as well. So what are some of the other things that we need to keep in mind considering how pervasive this is and how the damage can really have massive ripple effects?
Hmm. So, yeah, the ripple portion of it. So, it's exacerbating inequality if we're not careful about it. AI systems, if not carefully designed and monitored, can really worsen the socioeconomical disparities that we're already seeing within the world, amplifying existing biases in areas such as credit scoring, hiring, and legal judgment. Also, loss of trust. We're already seeing there's already a potential for bias AI outcomes to erode public trust of these systems. And the need really for ethical frameworks when it comes down to it. We're seeing the EU AI law coming out with that framework. We're seeing executive orders coming out. So having better control of these systems, being forward leaning with safety and security when we're putting them out there, and just being cognizant that these systems may naturally create biases and be unfair.
Okay. Now, one of the things that becomes very important when it comes to this is also the fact that some laws are starting to emerge, and we have some that are happening at the local level, some of them at the state level, some at the national level. And what we are seeing is that Europe seems to be a little bit ahead of the curve when it comes to legislating some guidelines around this. So what are we seeing as relates to that, and what is the prognosis, if
Mm.
you will? Because as we learn from GDPR,
Mhm.
a lot of it started in Europe and then that kind of spread
Yep.
around the world. So is that also happening in the AI space?
Absolutely. That's my personal opinion on that. I truly believe, like we saw with the GDPR, and then we started seeing local laws pop up, especially California's local data protection law. I think we're gonna see something similar with the EU AI Act. But organizations venturing into this realm of AI integration really need to be cautious, particularly in light of the EU AI Act, because unlike the GDPR and the fines that are associated with that, which there are some hefty fines, if you read the draft that's out right now, these are much larger fines that you're going to see. They're taking this, it appears, much more seriously. Not that they didn't take data privacy seriously, but I think it's because they're understanding that ripple effect and the larger scale impacts that AI could have. So you've got that risk of bias AI decisions too that you need to be looking at. Legal action, I think, are going to become more prevalent in this space. We're going to start seeing financial penalties and damages to the reputation of the organization. No organization wants to have their brand damaged. And then the just overall importance of compliance. This is really critical as more compliance frameworks come out. It's really ensuring that those AI systems are acting fairly and they aren't discriminating against the population that they're supposed to be evaluating.
So this is very helpful, by the way, just to understand some of these dynamics playing out and how they're impacting what we do. So, from an equitable perspective, because it's a big part of what we're trying to address here, and we understand the biases behind it. So, what are some of the things that can be done
Mm.
to help address some of those at a more tactical level, at organizational level?
Yeah, one of the things that you could do, and I mentioned this earlier, but it's really all about diversifying the data set. We're pulling data from the internet, wherever you're pulling it from. It could naturally have historical data or historical biases because of historical data. So being really cognizant of that, making sure that you're diversifying it and representing the data from varied demographics to help ensure fairness overall. And then the other thing is fairness audits and bias checks. This is really important. We're seeing more of this get rolled out. This is regular audit checks, and it doesn't just need to be an audit. Maybe it's an assessment, maybe it's an assurance check. The assurance check is ensuring that the system is operating appropriately. And then you've got fairness and enhancement intervention. And this is really a proactive intervention, such as using specialized algorithms to help mitigate biases in AI predictions. Because, I mean, these machines are extremely smart. We can also train them to help us do continuous monitoring of the systems and help us essentially be able to mitigate biases and catch them early on. And then the last thing is that multidisciplinary team involvement. Something that we're seeing already is that gap in talent. So we understand that this is already a challenge trying to find the right individuals that are at that expert level. I mean, you've got to know statistics, and you can hire Dr. Murdoch for that. He's got it. But I don't have the statistical background. But what I do have, and where I would be helpful, is I understand the GRC, the governance, risk, and compliance. So you need a diverse team that understands not just the statistical and the technical piece, but can help you with that risk management piece, that governance piece as well.
Yes, that's very important, and I like that multidisciplinary approach as well. And one of the things to think about has to do in terms of how we are going to look at bias, right, and how it becomes a threat to fairness, and how it overlaps into the general theme around ethics. So from that perspective, in terms of fairness and achieving that and making sure that it's built in and maintained, what are some of the dynamics around the social impact and the business implications, right? How do we balance those, considering what's at play here?
It is a balancing act. It's like balancing and harmony at the same time to try to have both of these. So you've got the social impact we've talked about, because AI bias, it's far reaching. It's seeping into all aspects of our lives. And if not careful, what we're seeing is maybe possibly that exasperation of social economic disparities that we want to make sure that we really avoid. We don't want to have an unjust outcome. We want to be able to utilize this for good and help like multiply and add value to our day-to-day lives, but you're going to have that social impact. So addressing AI bias is really critical for fostering a more equitable society. On top of that, you've got that business implication. And this is where you're starting to see a lot of AI getting rolled out, because we want to make money, but we also want to increase our workload. Like AI now can do one person can do 5 times more work because of AI. Thank you, AI. But at the same time, you've got regulatory scrutiny that's coming out and create like really focusing on AI fairness. And then you've got that negative publicity around it. So just taking those into consideration. And then last thing is just really prioritizing fairness and inclusion when you're working with and utilizing these AI systems.
Very good. So building on this conversation here in terms of fairness, we have different dimensions to it, right? We have the AI part, we have the ML part, but we really need to have a good appreciation for what fairness is all about and how it can be built. But like I said earlier, and I want to make sure this is emphasized, is that it's not just a one-time and done. It's a dynamic that continues. So from that perspective, then how can we help the organization and work with our partners, right, or vendors, in terms of making sure that fairness is built in and maintained throughout the life of these tools?
Yeah, so fairness in simplified terms is ensuring that the system is operating as it was intended to operate in a fair manner. So one of the ways that you can ensure that you're having AI fairness is correcting and eliminating those algorithmic biases, whether based on race, ethnicity, gender, class, whatever the factor is, essentially making sure you're building a fair and inclusive AI system. Make sure you're working with your vendors and you have transparency documents. You're able to know and ensure that it is creating a fair environment for your organization and for the individuals that it's being utilized for.
Okay, and ML as a subset of AI definitely also can benefit from that, and making sure that it's going to be built in as it's going to do its own learning, understanding that there are different ways this can happen, right? Sometimes you have a human behind it that is going to kind of, let's call it, steer it, but in some cases you have another machine
Yep.
that is doing that training as well. So
Right.
that being the case, we need to make sure that we have the right people behind it, making sure that this
Mhm.
is going to happen. So from an ML perspective, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so keeping in mind, machine learning is like the machine behind AI. They're separate things. And with machine learning, the primary focus of machine learning is to be able to design, train, and evaluate machine learning systems in a way that prevents the production of unfair and biased results. So, machine learning fairness really encompass strategies for identifying and mitigating biases at various stages of that machine learning pipeline.
Okay. Now, when I think about fairness, when I think about anything really, a big part of it boils down to a process,
Hmm.
right? And we spoke earlier in terms of there's an input, there's the box, right, whether
Hmm.
it's white, gray, or black, and then we have the outputs. And in many cases, we have a circular element with that too. There's data that's going in, something is happening, and then
Hmm.
we bring more data and more data. So that being the case, then we think in terms of procedural dynamics around fairness. What should we know about that?
Yeah, so breaking down procedural fairness in AI machine learning refers to the fairness of the processes and the procedures used in developing and deploying an AI system. So when we're thinking about this, think about it focusing on ensuring that the methods and the workflows used to create and actually implement AI algorithms are transparent, accountable, and devoid of biases.
Okay. And another term that we may have heard is substantive fairness. So what is that?
Yeah, substantive fairness is addresses the fairness of actual outcomes or decision produced by the AI or the machine model system. It goes beyond procedural fairness and assesses whether the results generated by AI algorithms are fair, equitable, and free of discrimination or biases.
Okay. Now, the algorithms are driving all of this. So,
Mhm.
what are some of the things we need to know about as relates to that in terms of how this plays into this dynamic and how it's going to help us or not?
Yeah, it's keeping in mind again that algorithm fairness. This needs to be a driving force behind developing AI algorithms, and algorithms often produce bias predictions. They do that again by the data that you're putting into the algorithm model, by the filters that you're utilizing, by how it's being trained overall. So the challenge here is just ensuring that you're doing continuous monitoring and you're using appropriate metrics to validate the outputs and ensuring that you're serving all of the populations at all times.
Okay. So, as we look at this general subject area and we talk about the biases and the fairness and we touched a bit in terms of legislation that's already in place, but there are a number of different other tools that can also help us along the way, right? One of the things we want to help our viewers to appreciate is the fact that they're not alone, and that in addition to the EU AI Act, and we have local and state and so on, there are a number of other tools that they can also leverage when it comes to understanding what's happening and using
Mhm.
those to move us forward. So what are some of the tools that they can use, and what would benefit from that?
Yeah, so keeping this really high level for you all, but providing you with some resources that you can dive into on your own. We've got the Google What If tool. The Google What If tool offers you a powerful platform for conducting comprehensive analysis of machine learning models. It's great to allow users to explore model performance, interpret predictions, and understand model behavior in various scenarios. So this is a great tool for just diving in and understanding how that model's operating. The next one you have here is Machine Learning Fairness GYM. So this provides a valuable resource for assessing the fairness of machine learning models, and it offers tools and metrics to be able to evaluate metrics and fairness within that model. The next one we have is IBM 360 Fairness. This is pretty well known, I think, in the community. This is a fairness toolkit offering a comprehensive set of tools and algorithms to address the fairness concerns in an AI algorithm. And then the last one, I'm probably going to say this wrong, Aquitas. It's a powerful tool for conducting bias and fairness audits. So that's great for machine learning applications. And then the last one is FairLearn. I see it as a very valuable resource for organizations looking to improve the fairness of their AI algorithms.
So we have a lot of different tools, and of course, new ones are emerging every day that will help us navigate this space. So, what other things should we know and do that will help us get closer to that ideal state?
Yeah, so it's definitely critical to be able to identify vulnerabilities and inconsistencies early on in public data in any data sets that you're trying to pull in before you even put it into an AI model, for example, to really ensure that integrity and the reliability of the AI systems. Another thing is just a general bias prevention and mitigation. So employing bias prevention and mitigation tools, some of the tools that I just mentioned, is essentially allowing you to address biases in machine learning processes. And then the last thing is just thinking about evaluating those algorithms for biases, doing it with continuous monitoring, which is key. If we move into reducing biases, what we're looking at right now is trying to think about how can we reduce the biases. So think about, again, going back into data sets, making sure that you have a very large data set that will include the underrepresented population that you may be looking at. Another is just effective techniques to mitigate biases stemming from the underrepresented groups. Also, impact of data set expansion. Another thing is considering the examples of like an income prediction system that exhibits gender bias in a classification. And we have an example here. They found that if they had increased a data set by a factor of 10, those mistakes would have occurred 40% less frequently. And that's just a general example for you to see how just making small changes can actually have really positive impacts. And that's in both ways.
Yeah. So that's what a big takeaway here is the fact that, and that's why the communication with the engineers is so important to understand how it was built and what are those variables that drive the algorithm and how one of those, the weight on some of those may be more than others and how it can influence the outcome. So we need to take a quick pause as we share another question. And of course, the opportunity for our viewers to provide some responses and to share their insights and reaction to what we're talking about. So let's have the third polling question displayed, and we'll give you a few seconds so that you can answer that, and then we'll comment on that at the other side of this. And just another reminder for our viewers that if they have a question they would like us to answer, to please share that with us and we'll address it during the Q&A session as well. Very good. So as we are thinking in terms of how all of this comes together, right, we're just waiting a few seconds for the responses to come through, but very important to also think in terms of the social responsibility associated with AI and ML. And corporate social responsibility as a thought, as a concept, as a driving value within organizations has been around for a few decades. And as we see how artificial intelligence plays a bigger role in our lives, then we need to be mindful about how we can achieve that as well and embed it into our business model. So let's take a look at the responses from our polling question. So does your organization design and create AI algorithms? 5% of you said yes, it is key to our business model. So that's a very low number. And then the other response here is yes, but only for internal use. And that's a little bit higher. That's 14% now. We don't have an AI strategy yet. Now, that's an important thing to consider, and we see the number being very high. Again, the newness of it definitely speaks to that. 57% of you say we don't have an AI strategy yet, and that may be something to consider, especially in the spirit of governance. And then, I don't know, 24%, and my suggestion, recommendation to you is like it has been in the past, think about it and perhaps reach out to the stakeholders in your organization to see what may be necessary to be done there. So let's pick up on this subject of social responsibility and what it means in the context of AI and the algorithms that's driving all of this. How does that play into this?
Yeah, so when we're talking about socially responsible AI, or we can call them SRAs, we're really looking at SRAs to actively identify and be able to mitigate biases within the AI system. So they go beyond more of the functionality functionality, but they're looking at prioritizing fairness and equity in their decision-making process. We're also looking at an SRA having fairness and equitable just outcome. So this is considering, like, thinking about the algorithm prioritizing fairness as a main factor. And then we've got that transparency and the accountability piece. So we're looking at mechanisms for accountability and having those mechanisms really built into these algorithms, allowing for that key oversight and recourse in the case of errors or bias being identified. And then just generally just guiding with ethical principles, having these AI systems be able to really emphasize the importance of avoiding harm and discrimination and really promoting that well-being of individuals in society as a whole. And with that being said, we want to provide you all with an infographic that really helps you to consider some things when you're creating socially responsible AI algorithms. And so when we're looking at that, we're looking at AI algorithms, we essentially want to be able to look at trust in those systems. And with that, you're going to have fairness, essentially. So when you're thinking of these, how do I create an SRA within my environment, especially those individuals that said, we're using this within our organization, looking at this as like, how are SRAs working? Are they fair? Are they absence of prejudice? How can we make sure that they're absent of it? Do we have a transparency document that really lays out the purpose of this system, how it's being utilized, why it's working the way it is? And then lastly is safety, the conditions of it being used, protecting the risk, making sure there's accuracy and reliability and security and robustness from these systems.
Very, very helpful. Yes, because as we think about the organizational values, and quite often in the United States and many other countries, we see that corporate social responsibility is one of their values. And we want to be mindful of that and how that incorporates into this subject area. So very good. Thank you so much for helping us better understand the complexity associated with a lot of these different topics. Let's now spend a few moments as we look in terms of how much time we have left, but we definitely want to spend some time responding to some of the questions from our viewers. So Yukti has a question for us. What are some good practices to look for when doing a security audit for AI-based products? What are some good practices to look for when doing a security audit for AI-based products?
So first thing that I would look at as far as good practices in place is I would go to, how is the system operating, the purpose of the system? Do you have a transparency document in place? We talked about model cards, but I would say, like, are there model cards established, policies and procedures that are in place for that system in particularly?
Okay. A couple other things in terms of auditing that or looking into it. I think a lot of it will have to do with in terms of what's the context. Is it homegrown or is it something that you're sourcing from a third party? And what's the objective? What is it supposed to be doing? And how can we relate the objectives to what it's doing in terms of output? So I think that will help tremendously in that regard. And I like what you said about model cards as well and documentation related to the design and the functionality of AI.
Yep.
Okay, so let's take a look at another question. This is from Chris. The question from Chris is, are there any steps being taken to improve these systems? And I guess more to it, as there only a handful of primary companies. Okay, so I think that the beginning part of the question is certainly the meat of this. In terms of, are there any steps being taken to improve these systems?
Yeah, so there are steps. We're seeing various different, and not just the system as a whole, but let's look at this like holistically right now. And we're seeing steps being taken with the executive orders that are coming out for safe, secure systems. We're also seeing frameworks that are coming out from various different organizations. I think ISO came out with one. I know NIST has come out with one. We're seeing For Humanities come out with one. I know there was a second part of that question.
Because there are only a handful of primary companies that do this. Yes.
Yep, there are only a primary. One of the organizations I'm aware of that do AI audits, for example, is Babel. So there's not, I will tell you, make sure, depending on the organization that comes to you and says, I can do these audits, make sure that you check and reference their work, because this is such a new and emerging space. It is very much the Wild West, but there are organizations that are doing a great job at spearheading some of that change. And I think we're going to see, like we said before, for. I think we're going to see a lot more change when this EU AI Act comes out and is approved, probably in the next month or two.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. I think the AI Act is up for review, but my understanding is that it may take a little bit of time before it gets ratified and rolled out and everything. Now, the United States is also looking
Mm-hmm.
into that, and we have something. I think you mentioned the executive order
Mm-hmm.
and so on.
Yep.
So there's some guidance coming out, and of course, we're all fans of NIST
I love
and,
NIST.
and the guidance that it provides. But you mentioned several organizations, so that's very helpful.
Yeah.
The third question, and I think we pretty much this will probably be the last question we are able to answer, but very important one as well. This is from Chris Y. If organizations want to use a multifaceted slash diverse group in AI development,
Mm.
what sources exist to advise on
Mm.
how to best include those teams?
That's a great question. My best guess on that one, because I obviously haven't developed these, but I will say from my experience working with organizations that are working on building out these multifaceted groups, it's the approach is multifaceted in its own way, in that you're looking at various executive orders. But what I'm thinking of is the NIST just recently came out with a consortium, and they came out with the AI Safety Institute, and that is providing some guidelines, and they're bringing together a multifaceted approach on how to tackle AI bias fairness and developing frameworks and certifications on creating a more secure environment. So that, if it was me, that would be one of the first things that I would do, is kind of research what is out there within the NIST space. But Dr. Murdoch, I don't know if you might have some more guidance that you would want to provide on this.
I know a couple of things that come to mind. One of them has to do with privacy and security, and there are several tools, right, from NIST and others that I think will be very helpful in that regard. Making sure we consider that, and maybe an overarching concept here will be in terms of risk management. So we do the risk assessment, we identify all the different repercussions of what we're doing with these tools and how it could impact organizations in different ways, and then we bring that to senior management and we say, okay, this is what we think about this, and of course with the feedback from senior management and others, and then think in terms of how we're going to sell that idea and the need for a multifaceted group to then address it. Because
Yeah,
and
that's a
you
good idea.
made reference to this earlier in today's session, where we're talking about the fact that we have the statistical side of things, we have the technology side, the security side, the legal side, we have the ethical side, right? So many different elements there. So when we're doing that work now within the organization, I think it's like a mirror. So now we understand from a risk perspective the different ramifications, and then we take it backwards and say, okay, from a legal perspective, what should we do? From a technology perspective, what should we do? From a security perspective, from a privacy perspective, and then we make sure that that cross-functional perspective is reflected in how we address it. So I think that that will probably help us tremendously in that regard as well.
Absolutely. Love the questions.
Yeah. Oh, they're tremendous. They're
Yeah.
very, very good and very appropriate, and definitely we can see that people were really thinking about
Yes.
this.
Yeah.
So this is definitely what we would like to see, and we saw it. So I find it dynamic enough in that it may seem overwhelming on the surface, but having the opportunity to talk with you about these type of things, and as we apply the thing that we know already into this space, I think it will help us move forward with confidence.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for helping us better understand some of the mechanics around it, some of the implications, and some of the tools and resources available to us, so that we can now look forward to this and move more confidently forward.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
And to our viewers, thank you very much for joining us today, and I hope you join us again in the future for our future webinar as well. Thank you.